Welcome to the final day of the CTM 2021 Transformation Discourse Program. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Ollie Zhang. I am one of the discourse curators at the festival. I'm really excited to close off this edition of the festival's discourse program with two brilliant thinkers who are taking part in this conversation titled From White Brothers with No Soul to Black Counterculture. This discussion will ask questions such as how have Europe and the USA negotiated with their respective colonial legacies, and how do these differences manifest in music and culture? This conversation will depart from Alexander G. Weheliye's analysis of Berlin techno in White Brothers with No Soul, an interview that you can find on the CTM website in the magazine section, as well as DeForrest Brown Jr.'s work in his forthcoming book, Assembling a Black Counterculture. They'll consider the developments of techno and Blackness and their entanglements in various stages of post-war colonial globalization. Alexander G. Weheliye is the author of Phonographies, Grooves in Sonic Afro-Modernity, as well as Habeas Viscus, Racializing Assemblages, Biopolitics, and Black Feminist Theories of the Human. He's currently working on two projects, respectively titled Phenon, R&B's Technologies of Humanity, and Black Life / Schwarzsein. DeForrest Brown Jr. produces digital audio and extended media as speaker music and is a representative of the Make Techno Black Again campaign. On Juneteenth last year, he released the album Black Nationalist Sonic Weaponry on Planet Mu. And primary information will be publishing his first book, Assembling a Black Counterculture, later this year. They'll speak for just over an hour, and I'll be back for the Q&A at the end. Today, we'll just be using the YouTube chat for questions, so please do send them along as you think of them. So yeah, without further ado, welcome Alexander and DeForrest.
Hello, good morning for me still. Yeah, good to be here. And when we chatted yesterday, we talked about DeForrest getting us started and setting the scene, so to speak, and then we'll take the conversation from there. And maybe you can start with talking a little bit about your book and the overarching argument, and
So Assembling a Black Counterculture is my attempt to kind of gather up American history, starting in both the transatlantic slave trade with, so starting in 1553 and also in 1619, which is the first, I call the first investment of seed money, which is black bodies into the startup that is America from the European colonial forces. And so taking this like beginning of the labor and industrial trade and building up slowly into firstly, what like civilization is, like what it means to raise down an entire civilization and build up cities. And then like second most, like what happens to a group of people, black people who were essentially and are still essentially legally considered non-human robots, if you will. Like what happens to a slave class that then enters the future, that moves into these urban environments from the Deep South and begins to touch electronic gear. What the book kind of covers. I mean, yesterday we talked a bit about the sort of platitude of like Kraftwerk invented techno that is often thrown around. And what I want to explore with the book is this idea that technology itself seems to be racinated and seems to have this idea of, sure, technology like an 808 drum machine or whatever is supposed to be open source technology for anyone to use and express through, but it seems as if anyone who is non-white who touches this technology and creates anything kind of gets racinated into a sort of Western canon of technical thinking, a la like the end of a 1,000-year Enlightenment era period. So the book wants to treat techno as a sort of moment of, I'll say reconciliation, if you will, and a moment of sort of global consciousness of this music being exported and kind of growing a second life in Europe, and like what it means to live inside of a techno society, a society that is ensconced in technology, rooted in technology, ruled by technology, and also the technocrats or the technical specialists that allow for this civilization to run and exist. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's great in terms of having a broader and deeper historical approach. One of the things, and this will bring us to techno, that I would say with regard to technology, and when you're talking about 808s, for instance, right, that on the one hand, yes, there is this way that Black musicians and other artists sort of have to work within those confines. But there are also a lot of examples where, such as the 808 or the 303, where these were considered at some point technologically trash, literal, right? In the trash heap. And Black musicians came along and made them what they are, right? In the contemporary moment. And it's kind of this back and forth between those two strands, right? On the one hand, sort of being imprisoned by these technologies, but also constantly trying to break free from those imprisonments as well. And that's how we get techno. That's how we get house. That's how we get disco. That's how we get dub reggae, right? In terms of like pushing against those limitations of the actual machine.
Yeah, there's a funny backbone to this that I find interesting, and it's like kind of the utmost reason that I'm writing this book is so we talk about the 808 and the 303, these instruments made by Roland Technologies. I can't remember the guy's name, the CEO and founder of Roland, who supposedly invented MIDI, but one of the things I write into the book is that actually he did not invent MIDI. It was a guy named Don Lewis who was from Tuskegee, Alabama, was in college at Tuskegee University around the same time as my aunt, and Lionel Richie, like randomly the Commodores, but also during the Tuskegee experiments that were being done. Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, the Tuskegee experiments were happening, right, where the U.S. government was using this college campus to inject syphilis into Black people and leaving it untreated to see the long-term effects of syphilis on these people. At the same time, Martin Luther King was kind of rolling through and also kind of rallying together what would become the civil rights movement that would happen in my hometown of Birmingham. But anyway, Don Lewis from this college was a gospel singer and pianist that was making songs for Martin Luther King Jr.'s rallies, and ended up getting into nuclear. He became a nuclear scientist in the military, and actually in the 70s began putting together and linking together Hammond organs with the sort of drum machines or the rhythm makers that the guy from Roland was making in his company before Roland. And actually the guy who invented, the guy who supposedly invented MIDI met Don Lewis at a conference, a tech conference in, I believe it was in San Francisco, and saw this guy with his rhythm machine linked up to a Hammond organ making this like rhythm and blues music and like rhythm and soul music. And he was like, how did you do this? And, Don Lewis kind of responds, through like circuit bending, which is a very abstract. I mean, you think about James Sinton saying like wave jumping. He's like a scientist who's trained in like literally splitting atoms, but his like circuit bending, his means of like his technique of taking wires, splitting them, and kind of rerouting them was the thing that ultimately became MIDI. And that guy hired Don Lewis to basically build the 808 drum machine with 3 other people. So I say all of that to say, when we talk about even this modern contemporary understanding of like Black people in urban environments flipping the 808, there was rhythm and blues already built into the 808 all the way at its core through this like Japanese technology, if you will.
That it's completely in its DNA and has always been there. I would definitely, support that, right? And if you look at certain kinds of other technologies, you will come to the same kind of conclusions, right? But on the other hand, we're also confronted with this violent making invisible of those things constantly, right? That's how we get to, at a certain point, people both in Germany and in the United States thinking that, being surprised that techno was not necessarily invented in the traditional sense, but the techno is Black music, right? And it kind of allows for that particular forgetting, because Black people and Black culture, whether this is on the African continent or in all the different places in the diaspora, are always assumed to be non-technologically savvy, to put it in contemporary language, right? But if you look at the history of veritably any technology, particularly music, anything having to do with music and sound, Black music and Black culture and the involvement of Black people will be central if you scratch beyond the surface, right?
I like your use of the word savvy, actually. I went to look it up really quick because that's something I like to do with the English language, is treat it as a technology that is foreign to me. And again, taking this back to African-American kind of, or like my background. So my great-grandfather was a slave until 1930 and managed to like kind of buy his way out of slavery, or like kind of swindle his way out of slavery through the slave owner's daughter, who the slave owner couldn't read, but the daughter could, and helped him like get out of slavery. And he used this sort of like miniature reparations money to buy a plot of land and build a house with his own hands in a neighborhood that later in from 1945 to 1965 would be bombed over 50 times by white nationalists. But anyway, the thing is, my great-grandfather couldn't read. I often think about this idea of the miracle of a Black person being able to read, write, and speak the English language. And as slaves, like Black people were kind of like put in this like, or African Americans were put in this like really like isolated environment where there was nothing. We were mute people. And so anyway, as I play with the English language, and as I use it, I like to think about its bits in a very foreign and like othering way. But anyway, the word savvy breaks down into shrewdness and practical knowledge. And it's interesting because there's something very practical and dare I say more rational about the way that Black people have touched technology than our European counterparts, in the sense that, when you listen to Kraftwerk, or even when you listen to something like Three Phase or something, it's very much in the machine. And I'll mention someone like Mark Fell, who makes these kind of, in the 90s, it was like, with S&D making this like generative additive house music where he's taking every little like preset beat and then like multiplying it by 5. The Aleppo also did this in France with N+1 or whatever. But with techno, with house, there's this sense of just simply touching the gear and hearing what comes out, and the technology being one's own internal rhythm. And and I don't know, when I read your interview, White Brothers with No Soul, I kept thinking about your bringing up of nationalism, your bringing up of like this sort of Germanness to techno music. And it's kind of like, well, if Juan Atkins was making techno just kind of like, banging out beats live into a mixer, which means he was like taking his own movements and sounds and exporting it into a mixer and a recorder and like a separate device, and panning like and moving kind of the faders that way. We're talking about a music that, like, when we're talking about Black music, we're literally talking about a photocopy of something Black people are naturally doing, and then is being analyzed and scanned by people like Kraftwerk into what we now call a, like, I guess, 4 on the floor, straight ahead techno.
But I think, I don't want to let go of the 4 but the 4 on the floor, right? Because it has such importance for Black music, from disco to techno. And what I wanted to bring up in terms of the kind of rationality and, better approach to technology, that yes, it was about the expression and about the sound, but oftentimes, particularly, I think in the beginnings with house, but also to a certain extent techno, that it was about getting people to move, literally, right?
Yeah.
That it had, and that to me, it's a kind of ritual function, right, of these sounds, and not ritual in some kind of like...
Well, it's funk and soul. It's putting some sauce in there. You think about James Stinson, he's like, you get in there and you make the instruments talk. And I've never seen, and that's what the phrase White Brothers with No Soul is kind of speaking to. And you quote it, was it DJ Tanith? Yeah, he said it himself. White Brothers with No Soul. And what soul is putting some sauce in there, drop some spice, and like really making the machine do something it wasn't intended to do. And that takes an other, like a literal, like Lacanian othered, or maybe delusion, othered, like, experience from something.
Mhm.
I mean, I moved to New York in 2013 from Alabama, and I like to tell people this because it explains a lot about my work, but also kind of like sets a precedent. Birmingham is a very segregated place and has been segregated and was violently segregated like through the entirety of its existence. So I didn't meet.
I mean, all major cities in the United States are extremely, it's just a matter of degrees. I mean, I know that
Yeah,
Birmingham, Alabama, I don't want to take the specificity, but
yeah,
just to also give a broader kind of context to this, that
mhm,
all Chicago is completely segregated.
yeah, yeah,
New York is, Los Angeles, et cetera, and so on. You can go to any place, and it's just a matter of degrees. So that's all. That's the
yeah.
footnote.
And this is all planned. I mean, yesterday we kind of talked about this idea of America being an open concentration camp where, I mean, you have these sort of like legal lines drawn up where, you know, like in Birmingham, where I'm from, there's a literal mountain called like Red Mountain with like a Vulcan statue at the top, like the god of, steel and labor, that separates black and white communities. And similar to Detroit, after the sort of race riots that broke out across the country in '67, all of the white people moved from the city of Birmingham to the outskirts, to the other side of the mountain. So there's a literal separation where I had not experienced white Americans, let alone Europeans, in mass ever until I was 23. Um, and I bring that up to say that when I moved to New York, I wanted to see a functioning city. I wanted to see a city that was not suffering under the bankruptcy of that happened after the Civil War when the
Mm-hmm.
Northern European funded industrial states beat down the South and bankrupted it basically. And so anyway, I say all this to say that I moved to New York to see again, like to see skyscrapers, like real buildings, to see planned, gridded environments. And there's a foreignness to this that I think really has to be understood when we're talking about like a house music making someone move. I mean, there's the crack epidemic happening at the same time, which was a government operation where crack is being proliferated through these segregated black neighborhoods while the AIDS crisis is raging. You have Ronald Reagan taking his arrogant self over to Berlin, saying there's only one Berlin, which he doesn't get to say that, but you have this person who's shifting borders and moving like the entire global map like a modular game board, and then in these clubs, you have people like Ken Collier, Larry Levin, Frankie Knuckles being like, move your bodies, like feel something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I can't stress enough how like that this music is a distress signal music. It's like times are hard. Reaganomics was very difficult. And there's an interesting parallel to the wall falling and the level of, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I was going over some of the materials that I'd collected over the years, especially from interviews, both with folks from Detroit, but also with folks from Berlin and folks from Detroit about Berlin, especially that early moment. And I think it was Robert Hood that said, who was a part of underground resistance at a certain point, right? At
Mm-hmm.
that point, he was part of underground resistance, and he said when he came to Berlin in the early 1990s, he sort of felt like that Black people in Detroit wanted to forget about their past, in the sense
Mm-hmm.
of the Black people in Detroit wanted to forget about slavery, Jim Crow, police killings, uprisings in the street, et cetera, and so on. And that Germans, particularly in Berlin, right after the wall came down, also wanted to forget their past, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at that moment, and still, the past that Germany wants to forget is the Holocaust. And because that's the only way you can kind of have a certain kind of what I would call like the nationalism of the white brothers with no soul, right? That
Mm-hmm.
Berlin techno, that Berlin techno becomes, and it doesn't only become that, but it kind of, now looking back on it, oftentimes it sort of becomes, that techno kind of becomes the way that German nationalism, which is de facto always white, becomes possible again, right? That people can sort of say, oh, this is the beginning of the Berlin Republic, and everybody came together with this music that didn't have any lyrics. You didn't have to understand it. It was so welcoming, and it was not, right? And it was like also a very, very clear maneuver at a certain point to make this something German, and therefore it had to become white, right? It had to sort of erase all the traces of Blackness in all these different kinds of in all these different kinds of ways, right? And I think that the history is different in the United States, but the effect is the same in that mainstream that in the mainstream that electronic music, electronic dance music is still considered to be something predominantly white and definitely not something Black.
Yeah, I mean, I love the way you say it just was not. And it kind of is as simple as that. Like, the history of Berlin that we know was not. It was a very privileged thing that happened in a small corner, like in the nice part of town, and then, moved its way over into East Germany, in a very somewhat colonial way, capitalist way. And it's, so one of the funny things about techno, and at least the way that I came into contact with it, was actually not through the music, but through Alvin Toffler's Third Wave. I found it in college for like a quarter, like at the library, and was reading about technocracies and reading about the industrial, or just the development of like what we call modern day civilization. So moving from a nomadic era into establishing closed agricultural environments, then building into like an industrial revolution, and then obviously into the sort of data interwoven cyber connected one we're in now. And it's the thing is, at the end of Toffler's chart, and Juan Atkins kind of suggests this when he first started reading, well, Juan Atkins read Toffler in a class called Future Studies in 1980 as Detroit was like plummeting financially, like the city of the future, the city that was the first city to like be designed for cars with the first highways and stuff, like was collapsing. And this guy, this 19-year-old Black kid, is reading about. And
it also, the other important thing historically about Detroit is that the auto industry enabled the existence of the largest Black middle class, in quotation marks, under erasure, and that was the beginning of its decline, of both the auto industry and therefore the decimation of the Black middle class is a misnomer, because there's so many studies that highlight that you can't ever really be. I was actually reading something about this like yesterday, that in the United States you can't ever be Black and middle class, because it's just two steps, one or two paychecks away from being not very middle class, right? So that's why I'm hesitating. But still, there was a, let's say, slightly affluent, big group of Black people in Detroit. So,
well, there's a few things that happened, right? Where you have a bunch of white people that were sort of, okay, so this book, like White Collar, from C. Wright Mills. Yeah, I think it's brilliant, because he talks about how in a single decade, all of the sort of free market entrepreneurial kind of endeavors, like all these individual businesses were immediately monopolized and bought up, and every white person was wearing like a tie in an office by like, the 1900s. And they're like, the Americans were immediately domesticated after 400 years of living out in the wild and like murdering Indians or natives. And, and so you talk about this idea of this like Black middle class, and there's a thing that happens to the white population where there's a sudden level of stability by being employed by these factories and being employed in white collar jobs. Then the crash happens, and then, FDR comes out with a New Deal and gives all these people lottery tickets to come to the Wizard of Oz land of like the America we know now. And so Black people running away from the Jim Crow era South, like through running away from the bombings that I've been referring to. Actually, this guy, James Boggs, I have to show people books sometimes. He actually came from Alabama and moved up to Detroit and was working in the Chrysler plant at that time. It was like working really hard to like unionize, and wrote this book called The American Revolution, Pages of a Negro Worker's Notebook, while observing the American population kind of getting even more subsumed into capital, into credit, into these sort of planned city industrial environments. And he predicted automation. He saw that just like with Black people not being a fast enough or sufficient labor for the South and being replaced with cotton gin machines, he was watching assembly line workers being replaced with machines. And that ultimately led, that sort of like lean production or that lean update of the production model kind of led to the collapse of Detroit in a lot of ways. So anyway, the relation to Juan Atkins is that in a similar way, he was trying to scale funk bands and the funk and jazz bands that his dad was booking in Detroit down to like, a single machine, or down to like a Korg MS-10 and a 808 or 909 drum machine. And so, yeah, at the same time, the city is collapsing, and he was thinking, what's the fourth wave? Where's this point where the body and soul like combines with these machines and something new comes? And Toffler was thinking about this as well, and what he saw was global consciousness. There's two options for a fourth wave: global consciousness or collapse. And it kind of seems like in lieu of collapse, techno, especially as it presented itself in the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany, was a weird kind of like escape hatch for a lot of people, where they got global consciousness in the form of MDMA and like all these drugs, and then the collapse was happening. And I mean, here we are now, 30 years later, and there's no more clubs, and it's not coming back.
Yeah. No, and thank you for bringing it back to the European context, because I did want to elaborate a little bit on it just is, or it just wasn't. Because I think part of what oftentimes gets forgotten, that this is not only the moment of East and West coming together, but it's also the moment where there was large scale police endorsed, in the sense that police were literally, there were all these pictures of police watching Black people and other non-white people, immigrants, refugees, being burned alive, being killed, being kicked out of trains, right? So I know, just in terms of my own personal experience, the techno spaces, once they became techno spaces, were not very welcoming, right? Whereas when I first sort of encountered house music, it was in the context of other kinds of clubs, and it was usually within the context of Black music as well, it might have been, prohibitive in other kinds of ways, but I didn't feel, like my personal safety was at risk, which is how it felt in a lot of ways. And it is very much an escapism, right? That, in that moment, who was able to think of themselves as being being freed, and then who had to worry about where they went in the city and whether that meant like that they were still going to be able to walk and live, et cetera, and so on, right? And I think it's also I look at it as part of like a longer tradition of a German, but also European way of using Black culture, particularly US Black culture, as this way to imagine oneself as free and freeing, et cetera, and so on, to sort of get away from like the strictures of Germanness. And but it's usually doesn't actually involve the input of the Black people and the Black cultures that are being that are being used. And the other thing that I would also highlight in that context is it also is always about locating Black culture and Black people like someplace else, right? So it's okay to love underground resistance, right? It's okay to venerate Angela Davis. Like, there are these huge campaigns in both East and West Germany in the 1970s to release Angela Davis from jail. I mean, they happen all around the world, but there's very, very little that shows, for instance, white German leftists actually working with non-white people, or later, beginning in the 1980s, with Black organizations in Germany that did exist since the 1980s, such as the ESD, Initiative Black Germans, or DEFRA, the Black German Women's organization. So yeah, it is definitely this kind of projection and use of techno, right? And at least initially, the kind of edge that the the Blackness sort of gave it, right? That enables this kind of imagination of, we can be free and together now, et cetera, and so on, right?
No, there's a history of this, right? And I mean, I always kind of joke that whenever African Americans, particularly those from the South, and Angela Davis is also from Birmingham, where
from
I'm
Birmingham.
from. Yeah, Sun Ra's from Birmingham, Gucci Mane, Birmingham. It's a interesting thing where, I mean, I wonder if there's a sort of, I mean, I imagine that Germans, especially back then, could not imagine the American landscape. I mean, A, because it's so big, but also B, just, you can't really see it. But I don't think they can imagine the sort of struggles that were leading to the sort of outcries that were happening from Black people down there in the form of music, in the form of Angela Davis, like protesting and doing her activist work. And it's weird because it almost seems like kind of a sublimation, right? To take what that edge and spice is taking what you're feeling and appreciating it from somewhere else. And it's a weird kind of like deflection.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, in America, theoretically is doing the same thing, because we talked also about like the American Forces Network being kind of established in 1945. And in a way, I kind of consider that to be a way that America took this Black music and started pushing it out into Central Europe and not playing it in Black communities. And, you know, Mad Mike from Underground Resistance is always complaining about the idea of the radio programming in urban neighborhoods where it was only rap music, it was only destructive music that was like documenting, you know, the destructions of urban environments.
And I mean, even before that the U.S. government hired, I think Dizzy Gillespie was one of them, that there's a longer history of hiring Black musicians to be agents of the U.S. state ambassadors. I think they were literally referred to as ambassadors. I forget with what qualifications. And that's the same kind of logic, right? That the United States government can sort of say, okay, look, we're supporting Black music. And then, you know, the people listening to the music, the white people listening to the music in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in France, et cetera, and so on, can also say, oh, look, you know, we're not racist because we are consuming Black music, right? But at the same time, we can stand by while Black and other people of color get murdered in broad daylight in public, right? Because that is what sort of constitutes the kind of anti-racist bona fides, right? And of course, it also doesn't threaten like their own self-image in any way, right?
Yeah, I mean, it does the same for Americans in an interesting way, that what happens seems to be a buffering device in the perceptions or the phenomenology of perceptions between, you know, Europeans and the UK and America. I mean, you brought up the sort of like initiatives with like Dizzy Gillespie, and I always like to show people this book, like how New York stole modern art and invented abstract expressionism. And yeah, I mean, exports it out to Europe to show, hey, look, we're not savages. Like, we have cities, and, you know, they grab people like John Coltrane and like puppet him in front of you in like, you know, Switzerland or something. He's like, see, John Coltrane, we don't hurt the Black people here, even though we like assassinated Martin Luther King, we assassinated, you know, Malcolm X, we assassinated Fred Hampton, and then like 150, you know, American cities erupt in race wars. And yeah, in the same token, there's this buffering that seems to be happening in Germany, this country that's trying to figure out what the hell it is after multiple, like, just catastrophic bombs being dropped on it, and like a total, like, you know, whatever you want to call the Nazi revolution, a sort of like zeitgeist moment where everyone gets like feverishly caught up in nationalism and like, a sense of togetherness to do something really fucked up. Like, I mean, I don't know what to really call this, like, forgetting that is trying to be done. I mean, if I wanted to be cruel, I'd call it both a military and government instituted psyop, but I would also call it a populist lobotomy kind of happening.
No, and the United States was very much involved in that. It contributed to that forgetting, and you know, there's all this documentation that came out later that showed, for instance, that the Allied forces had no problems continuing to work with people who had been fairly high up in the National Socialist Party. And the way that it's justified is, you know, we can't like erase a whole country. We need someone to be, you know, I don't know, the head judge in Munich, right? And so that a lot of the Nazis were definitely came back into power, even though there was this idea that there was a denazification and Nazifizierung, right? I mean, there are just so many things. Of course, you know, the Nazi racial state was also partially a product of colonialism, especially the eugenic policies, particularly colonialism in West Africa, Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia. Also that it was modeled, particularly the kind of race laws, right? The Nuremberg laws, that they were modeled on US,
Jim Crow.
Jim Crow, Crow laws, right?
Yeah, the stuff my family went through,
Yeah. I mean, it was literally taken from that. There's this kind of interesting side history, for instance, because the United States, the Holocaust was not called a genocide in the United States in the press, except by the Black press initially. And then there's also this kind of interesting, like I said, side history of German Jewish intellectuals coming to the United States and not being able to teach in American mainstream universities because they had Jew quotas.
Yeah, we had Nazi parades in New York.
They went to historically Black colleges and universities. There was a documentary, I think 15 years ago, called From Hitler to Jim Crow. And these people, they stayed in you know, I don't think it was at Howard, but it was several other. I would have to look it up. It's been a while since I read it. And yeah, through the Allied forces, then after the war, also really continued working with Nazis. So, you know, I think that you can't really look at the two histories as separate at all in even in that moment.
Well, it's a funny schism here, like that's really great in like tying these two experiences together in ways that, I mean, either side probably hadn't thought about. For one, yeah, I mean, you have the two underground resistance releases through, I guess it was distributed through Tresor, but released in like a Japanese label. It's like Global Allied Powers or something like that, or Global Techno Power. And you have like Robert Hood, Jeff Mills, Gerald Donald, and like, yeah, Underground Resistance releasing tracks called like Onslaught, Quicksand Area, or like other tracks like Nuclear Facelift.
Seawolf.
Yeah, exactly. And they're literally embodying like this dual Nazism that's taking place across, oh no, my phone's ringing. Okay. Yeah, this dual Nazism that's, I mean, I think about George Carlin in like the mid 2000s, he was saying on a show, you know, Germany lost, but fascism won. And you take like disco demolition in 1979 in America. I actually just asked a friend if Germans were even aware that disco demolition happened. And it's kind of interesting because you have like all the like 50,000 white people rushing in a sports stadium to destroy disco music, Black queer music. And then 10 years later, you have like a bunch of Germans being like, like techno is like with 2Ks and it has nothing to do with disco. I don't want to sound like disco. And there's a mutual, how should I put it? Disgust for joy and disgust for multiplicitous Black expression. And when I say Black, I want to use Black in the term of like Black data here, and like not just race, but like this unintelligible joy that's like yeah.
And the two are of course always connected, right? The Black in terms of the data, and in these in these other ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do this. As like a point of this. Yeah.
Definitely. That they're deeply connected. Yeah. And what I want to say, I just finished actually teaching a section on disco in my Black popular music class, because I think that disco had a similar fate as techno, in terms of how it really became equated, especially in the United States, with the Bee Gees and other, you know, white artists. What is really important to remember about the Disco Sucks campaign, it didn't happen. Like, my point is always like, disco sucks and disco ending only happened in the United States. It actually exploded everywhere across the world, right? It exploded on the African continent, the Asian continent. There's like disco from everywhere. And it was huge in Europe. There was a German music TV show called Disco, that was on until like 1985. So it was even in the kind of language. It was definitely there. But what remains, what needs to be highlighted with disco demolition is that it was not only, strictly speaking, disco records that were burned. It was records by Black artists, period. Records by Stevie Wonder were being burnt. Like, how do you burn a Stevie Wonder record?
It's the joy.
Like, how?
It's the joy. And
I mean, I know, but
I was listening to Intervisions and was like blinded by how beautiful it was. Like, and he's sitting there on those art synths, just like singing ghetto joy, and it's but it is important to remember, so that the hatred, right, that on the one hand disco becomes equated with the Bee Gees in the United States, but on the other hand their records were not being burned. And it also basically decimated what had become in that moment like the first real moment of Black music's crossover, right? And I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but it literally, there's this study that shows that, for instance, between 1977 and 1980, the number ones on the R&B charts, because in the United States music is still segregated, right, has always been, because there were different radio stations that there was an overlap between the number ones on the R&B chart and the number ones on the pop chart of 60% from 77 to 80. And then throughout the 1980s, it's something like 20%, maybe even lower. It's remarkable because it basically, and there were all these Black music stars, such as Luther Vandross, that did not cross over for many, many years. They were superstars in Black households. Actually,
they sold records, etc., and so on. And the disco sex thing did all of that, right?
Yeah, there's a few things that happened in the 80s that should be addressed here that's peculiar to Americans, and I don't think Americans would be willing to say this. So Ronald Reagan, is obsessed with destroying communism and like leaving it in the trash heap of history, as he said in his Evil Empire speech. And so he's like, let's do like the, cowboy psyop, like actor president he is. He's like, straps up in America and he's like, let's go, baby. Let's like, rev up this economy and like really just skyrocket it. And so, I mean, within like a few year period, he managed to kind of like increase the wealth gap between Black and white people like dramatically while dropping crack in the neighborhoods. And all the well-to-do white people were investing in stocks for the first time. And we're actually seeing the end of that sort of like, that new Wall Street, like Wolf on Wall Street kind of Gordon Gekko type of person, that Patrick Bateman type of person who did go to the tunnel in American Psycho. He went to the tunnel in the book. But you see this Gordon Gekko kind of person really trying to like manhandle the free market in a way that we just saw the other day with GameStop and like AMC stocks, just kind of like, being manhandled by the little guys. And I mean, what happened was white people had a come up, and every few years, particularly around times where Black music explodes, white people get this like jolt, and they just like suddenly get a lot of energy. They get like, either it ends in race riots or it ends in a Bataille like bludgeoning of the pig, and capital and the potluck, spills like money and blood for everyone. And yeah, it's a disco and Black.
No, just very, very briefly and this is something that still continues today, right? That if you look at
we're seeing it now.
American pop music, that the two of the biggest stars are Ariana Grande and Post Malone, who, for all intents and purposes, they're white musicians, but they get categorized, and even though they might not categorize themselves as that, as hip hop and at the very least as very R&B inspired pop, right? And the same sort of superstardom and success is not granted to the Black musicians who do work in those genres.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing where I'll keep like showing books because I'm obsessed with it.
It's great.
But yeah, I mean, I pull up like, these are the two books I've been using to do a sort of beginning of Black music, which starts in, Alabama. This idea of this traveling music, this blues music that is inside of you, and the lyrics are shifting and like are to each person. And this is kind of the beginning of the American music industry forming. Because I mean, to be frank, white Americans didn't have music for 400 years. Like, where was the music coming from? They would have to import pianos. They would have the money phonographs weren't invented until the 1800s. So they were just out there in the woods, like, in silence, and you hear it in the invention of ambient music and the loving of algorithm music now. And I mean, I can get into blind man Thomas Higgins, who, like, you know, the multi-instrument blind savant that was also sold in the first, like, primitive music industry. But anyway,
and they were all sold.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically, I would say that the general, even globally speaking, that the way that popular music has worked since the 1920s with the birth of the recording industry, that it has been about the exploitation in different kinds of ways of Black music, right? And there's always a moment where the Black performers are allowed, so to speak, to become successful, right? So that, you know, you had a Donna Summer, you had a Sylvester, but then you have to have the Bee Gees, right? In the same way that, you know, you had a Kanye West, you had a Jay-Z, you had a Nicki Minaj, and now you need a Post Malone and a Billie Eilish, etc., and so on. So
I mean, Motown plays with this in an interesting way, because this is the first time, and I mean, modern popular music comes from the structure that Berry Gordy, with the help of Norman Whitman and a team of producers, essentially early Black electronic musicians, they grabbed a bunch of random Black people and, like, hey, you three women over here, you stand here and I'll extract your voice. Norman Whitman will do his magic with it and, like, tie it together into this, like, Stockhausen multi-spatial, like, composition we call popular music. That's the sound of America. And I mean, I always think about how funny it is that Blue Eyed Soul is basically a bunch of, you know, North England dudes getting, like, drunk off of this, like, manufactured pop music. And that Neil Rushton, the guy who found techno, who called up Derek May and, like, got this whole thing to happen, like, putting on a compilation and, like, you know, changing the definition of it in the liner notes for Techno, the New Dance Sound of Detroit compilation. He was selling and listening to Motown pop music 10 years before that. And so he, just like Sean Parker, like, you know, stuck up the music industry twice in 10 years, so did, like, the guy who stole and exported techno. But anyway, again, what Juan Atkins and, you know, the Bellevue Three were trying to do was scale this, like, you know, Motown music down into a single box instrument. And, like, I mean, Juan Atkins was not aware of Frankie Knuckles. Like, it was Derek May that was tying the two together, because he kept going back and forth between But yeah, I mean, this extraction, it's interesting, because I mean, when you think about Kraftwerk kind of hitting up the R&B charts, like, 10 years later, like, just after Donna Summer and all that, you're seeing these forms, this expression being appropriated, and then suddenly the music opens up into, like, world music, and, you know, suddenly all these other sounds start coming in, and it's, I mean, the music industry is just a giant Eurocentric pot of, like, possible modular ethnic generic sounds that are
I'm thinking of Kraftwerk as in Supremes now. I hadn't really quite thought about
it. Or the Isley Brothers.
The Isley Brothers definitely. But I'm just thinking visually also that kind of model. And one of the things when I in my thinking and writing about the history of R&B music, one of the things that I like to trace is the clothing of what people wore on stage, and how in the earlier moments, like with the Supremes and the Temptations, and they were going to work. These were work uniforms that they were wearing, right? And that's what I'm sort of thinking about with the whole Kraftwerk thing. Whereas later that becomes, you know, first it's like super aspirational in the 1980s, and then, you know, it becomes more street, and then it goes back to the aspirational. But yeah, this idea of not only putting a group together in terms of how they sound, but in terms of the visuals, right? And working with that, definitely. That's also something to cross the pond again, that I think is important about the early moment of techno, that a lot of the groups that were at some point then called Eurodance in Germany, like the Real McCoy, Snap, I'm trying to remember now, Mr. Vane. I can only remember the song.
The Technotronic in Belgium,
The Technotronic in Belgium, Leila K in Sweden, Black Box in Italy, who were literally stealing Lolita Holloway and the singer from the Weather Girls. I can see her.
Yeah.
I'm not going to remember the name now. but they literally stole
Yeah.
her vocals and chopped them up.
I mean, you hear that with James Brown and drum and bass. Like, these amen bricks are straight from James Brown, like, funk conventions.
Yeah. But the thing is, they tried to sell it as having their own singer. And she was this beautiful Black Italian model, I guess, who didn't even speak English, let alone could sing in it. And they did that for a number of years. But I mean, CNC Music Factory did that in the United States too. So in any case, but this kind of modeling, but just thinking about that, that Eurodance moment as a moment where there was actually, even if they weren't necessarily involved musically, Milli Vanilli, of course, is also from that moment, that nevertheless, there was this visibility of Black Europeans on the pop charts in ways that had not really occurred beforehand. Because at least in Germany, for instance, even though hip hop initially was mostly Arab, Turkish, and by Black Germans performed by them, that once it goes mainstream, it's white performers all the way, right? That non-white hip hop rappers become like the not the norm.
I like this perspective because it makes me think of this book. And Toffler was thinking a lot about this idea of standardization, and so was Juan Atkins when trying to figure out his techno. And this book is like, for me,
I've not seen that in a long time.
Oh yeah, no, this is everything. I mean, if you want me to be real about it, as like a Black American from the South who didn't have access to all these, like, you know, the elementary school I went to was a school that was made by a slave abolitionist that, you know, was making a school for young homeless kids. Like my whole family went to that school, and we had to do alternative education, is I guess what I'm trying to say. So the rest of America that does have funded schools, you know, they're all taking these like standardized tests from like 1990 on, and they're all doing this thing where they're like charting themselves, going up, you know, it's like a self-Pavlovian, giant experiment where everyone's going like, is my credit score okay, daddy? Like, is my, like, you know, bank account okay? Like, how's my work? How's my grades? And you bring up the pop charts and this idea of standardization, and hitting the charts becomes a standard for what is good and what is populist and what is like, what can be like a zeitgeist. And I mean, again, Motown invents this idea of popular music, but it also sort of opens up this primitive idea of like what Black music can be from what was happening previously before in the Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, like jazz and blues scene. And like, it picks it apart and makes a really optimized modular music. And then later it gets like optimized further with these white faces to reign supreme across the charts. And it's interesting because you look at music from 1980 on, they've been using the exact same formula.
Same model.
And I can say the same about techno. I mean, that's why I kind of shit on the floor, because you listen to Juan Atkins and he's playing with his hands. When I play my speaker music, I'm playing with my fingers. It's all live. And it's one of those things where it's like, come on, make a beat that's not 4 on the floor. Try it. And, and you know, I haven't seen it yet. I go to Berghain and all I hear is a giant boom, boom. And, you know, it's like, come on, update the model.
Yeah, no, definitely update the model. I forgot I was going to mention earlier with Motown, but we're still here. An interesting tidbit, because popular music English used to not be the lingua franca of popular music. We have that there are recordings from Motown artists such as Marvin Gaye and the Supremes of their hits in different languages. So there's a German, I heard it through the grapevine. And I'm forgetting the Supremes hit. So they recorded these different kinds of versions because otherwise those records would not have sold in the German market, right? And just knowing that and realizing this is what they had to do for all these different kinds of for all these different kinds of recordings is definitely really interesting in terms of like not necessarily how far we've come, but just how much things have changed.
Yeah, I mean, Yellow Magic Orchestra also had to go through that, and I was reading a 83 issue of Billboard, and I mean, their producer was like, if we didn't like basically present them as like the geniuses of electronic music, like Americans wouldn't take it. And the thing is, they were working with Roland Gear before any of the German techno groups or any of the British techno groups, and so it's kind of interesting thing that our timeline gets like really screwed up sometimes with like who was touching what, and I mean obviously the Japanese get completely written out of the techno narrative,
Of course, yeah,
for a similar reason.
yeah. No, and I think that sort of again brings us back to the I guess one of the points that we started with this kind of violent erasure, right? And I think that despite this sort of image of Japan being a nation of robots, that nevertheless they still, like Yellow Magic Orchestra, cannot be folded into that narrative, right? I would also say that Sylvester is really important to the history of techno.
Yes.
Grace Jones is really important to the history of techno, but none of those artists, because they're not white, can be folded into that narrative of them being these geniuses, right? These kind of lone geniuses. And with Kraftwerk, I mean, it's just so they literally hired a black engineer to make their records sound more funky. And then, you hear like that statement by Juan Atkins that gets recirculated. It's like they were so unfunky that they were funky again. And I'm like, no, they actually knew what they were doing. And if you listen to, I think it's Computerwelt or Man Machine Menschmaschine, that album, it sounds really different than their other albums. There's a continuity, but I'm just like, oh, this actually sounds like what I would characterize as funky, like something that I would dance to, whereas I would not want to dance to Autobahn or, metal on metal or whatever the other thing is.
Once again, like, what do you do with Bernie Worrell? What do you do with Herbie Hancock, these dudes? Or like Les McCann, these keyboardists who are using the mixing board faders and doing
Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, like they're like literally performing stereophonics. I mean, and that's something we haven't quite gotten to, but I mean, it's kind of been going on. It's this concept of stereophonic intelligence that exists across all black music, across the diaspora, that does not exist. Yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, for me to kind of come back to this whole like techno as black music thing, what really sort of beyond all of the other things, what really irks me about this is that for me, I can't really listen to techno as separate from other genres of popular music, right? That I hear it within the context of hip hop, of R&B, of jazz, of funk, etc., and so on, and the kind of narrative that happens, particularly with techno and acid house in Europe, is that it completely gets disassociated from those other kinds of music, right? And it's a hatred of the joy, but it's also a hatred of the blackness and the queerness, right? And the queerness of blackness and the blackness of queerness.
Actually, I want to take a second because I saw a comment that in like the chat that actually may be interesting for us to take on, or not take on. It's just actually someone was kind of mentioning that it seems as if like black music outside of America is absent from my thinking, and I think that that's absolutely true and somewhat purposeful in the sense that, as I've stated many times across many interviews over the last few years that I've been speaking, is that I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, which is in a region called the Black Belt, named because a bunch of plankton in the Cretaceous period, died in this area and built up the soil to be really, really fertile, which allowed for cotton to be produced and to become the first material export from America. Also in Black Bottom, where Rick Davis, the other member of Cybertron with Juan Atkins, is from, there's a similar kind of situation there with like this soil. So this term black initiates within these regions and within this idea of white as meaning free. And we talked kind of earlier about this idea of like Germanness meaning free, and this idea of freedom is exported, i.e. through this American military kind of takeover and confiscation or whatever, manipulation, wherever we want to call it, of Europe. And I want to kind of I just wanted to state here that I talk about black as a kind of genre of existence that is particular, not necessarily to African Americans, but to what we've been talking about this whole time with like Motown, the modeling. I have no interest in being black if you want to speak in terms of like being racinated within like a Eurocentric thinking and canon to be perceptible to any white person within the canon or academia, whatever. Mm-hmm. What I want is this concept of a abstract home that is captured within blues music. It's the home that exists within us because there is no language through which we speak, through which we can remember, through which we can even recall in Africa, let alone the diaspora. Um, and this has a lot to do with what you were saying actually earlier, or maybe yesterday, about like Mike Huckabee and how he talked about, or it also Robert Hood, about being like, I wanted to escape home and get away. Um, yeah, I wanted to. I'm very much invested in like Pan-African efforts and very much interested in these like conversations, especially as it exists between people like Fela Kuti and like Roy Ayers and the sort of like Pan-African like. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to specify that when I talk about Black, I'm talking about the modeling of Black as it exists within a global export and a
Mm-hmm.
modern like teletronic like civilization, or I mean, if we want to be real,
Mm-hmm.
modernism or modern civilization is simply testing the idea of liberal democracy. We have not had liberal democracy. We have several ethnic ethnostates and aristocracies and false governments that exist across falsely held imagined communities across Europe, the US, and the UK. But we do not have a firm concept of democracy. And yeah, I mean, but I have a deep interest in your idea of Germanness for this reason, as opposed to Americanness.
Mhm. And what I would say is, I didn't talk about this earlier. I mean, in the same, not in the same, but in a similar way, that it is easier for folks in Germany to imagine, deal with, embrace Blackness when it comes outside, when from outside of Germany. I think
Hmm.
that that tendency also exists in the United States. I mean,
Yes.
anti-Blackness is global, right? There's no
Hmm.
question. That doesn't mean it's the same everywhere, right? Um, and there are very, very different histories. But there's also a way that, for instance, if you look at how, for instance, Black British actors are venerated in Hollywood,
Yeah.
because there's this assumption they're not just simply being Black, that this is
Hmm.
actually something, that they're doing, that is a skill in a way that, Black American actors supposedly cannot. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that that is a part of it. But there's also this kind of idea that because someone is Black and British, or Black and German, or Black and French, that they
Hmm.
are not as threatening,
Yes.
right, in the United States, because they don't have the same kind of gripes
Yes.
with the United States, because they were not victims of
Hmm.
of slavery, Jim Crow, genocide, etc., and so on, which is all bullshit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just
Exactly. It's a
completely not
buffering.
true. Um,
Yeah.
to
It's a
me,
buffering. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
the United States government is just as white supremacist as the German and the French government, but there is that logic there too. So for me, it's really important to think about the specificity of Blackness in the United States, in different places in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, et cetera, and so on.
Hmm.
But also to think about how all of this is part of like kind of the same
Well, construct of the
Wurzelfe.
Western world.
Yeah, like Wurzelfe, right? What is it
Yeah.
like? The primal I'm
Yeah.
like primal soup is the German the German term that is part of that. But I think we should go over to the questions.
Yeah.
Thank you two so much for this incredibly rich and far-reaching conversation. Yeah, so we've got a couple questions in from the YouTube chat. I'll just read one here. So this listener asks, I'd be super interested to hear more about treating the English language as a foreign technology. I'd like to hear more in depth about what that opens up linguistically.
I mean, this goes back to kind of what I was saying about the very material nature of what a Black person is in America as an African American. Is, I mean, alien abductions, this idea of the mothership, the UFO, is a reoccurring thing throughout modernist 20th century Black music, whether it's Parliament Funkadelic, Juan Atkins, Sun Ra, whoever else. And one of the first, or the first person to ever report having experienced an alien abduction was a Black man named Benny Hill, and who was married to a white woman. Both of them were sociologists, and both had nightmares of this abduction, and underwent hypnosis to begin to talk about it. And this sort of phenomenon that appears like in, I think it was 1953 was when the term UFO was like coined by the U.S. government. I've kind of theorized, along with like a friend of mine, Ariel Valdez, who I've done work with on Black national sonic weaponry. We've kind of been thinking about this idea of the mothership and the UFO and these abductions. And also, a lot of white people experienced this in the 90s as well. All over, they were also seeing angels. And there's a sort of psychosis that is specific to America of replaying the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade and what was happening. Where I know people like to think that there were like all these majestic wars that were fought by like the white colonizers coming in and like taking out the West Africans in a beautiful, brutal like war and game. And it's like, no, it looked like a horror film, and that's exactly what killing the natives here in America looked like. It was just brutal slaughtering, kidnapping people, shoving them in boats like sardines, and like literally not treating their body like cargo. Like imagine the way you treat a tree. A tree is a living thing that exchanges resources between each other. They speak, they scream when you cut their branches, they have family structures. I mean, they're quite like mushrooms. And you think about shoving together a bunch of West Africans that from different tribes, different racial ethnicities being then bred together. And I mean like literally bred like dogs together because we were property into a single muck called Black. And you're not allowed to read, you're not allowed to write, you're not allowed to speak any of your many native tongues, you're not allowed to observe any of your former religions. And the project that I did with Ariel on Black national sonic weaponry was him doing an oral sort of ancient, like West African griot kind of summation of the god Agun and sort of remembering the first slave rebellion in 1505 or the first like sort of insurrection. And when I think about Black nationalist sonic weaponry, as like my album is named, I'm tracing a series of these insurrections from 1505 until now. And that counts this summer. That counts the Ferguson riots. That counts when my family went to go march, in the Black Lives Matter protest this summer. And the KKK called my mayor, who was a young 30-year-old black male, called him and said, "We will kill every person who tries to take down a Confederate statue." And the black community form a militia group. They show up with guns and say, "Come on." That's that kind of engagement with reality, this trauma reality, times the idea of, I'll even go a step further and talk about like Frederick Douglass, this person who was one of the first books, and there's a woman as well, I can't remember her name right now, unfortunately.
Harriet Jacobs.
Yes, Hannah Black wrote a really great like piece about this. Yeah, I think about these slave accounts of being able to record data like W.B. Du Bois did with this, where he was able to like define what black people, like how we could be located in the U.S. after being sort of like shipped around like cargo and then shipped around again through industrial, movements and needing to go to different places to find work, but also having, again, been so like cargo. It's the kind of language. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one tidbit to the mix, particularly about language. I think if you look at, African-American vernacular English or Jamaican patois, or Haitian Creole, you can kind of think about how these major European languages such as French, English, Spanish, etc., and so on, are foreign and therefore are adapted by different Black and changed radically by different Black populations, right? And that very frequently to exist as a Black person in the United States, for instance, means being able to both speak standard English and AAVE, depending on the context. So I just wanted to add that to it.
Well, exactly. You think about code switching, you think about double unconscious or double consciousness, in which you are one, and I experienced this heavily, and I have my entire life, this future shock of being in this reality where there's four walls around me and a door. And even as a kid, I was like, what the fuck is a door? Like, what is this? And, I slept in the bed that my great grandfather died in, and that he built. Like, I was in his house, and I'm the caretaker of this house that he built. Mm-hmm. And it's a thing of growing up from age 5 to 10 in this bed in the house of this former slave. I would take like I didn't like to talk a lot. I like to write and draw, like write stories. And I would take like cardboard boxes and model and build cities, like miniature cities, and take little Velcro to kind of like take like cereal boxes and put it to the bottom of like cardboard boxes to make roads, and like literally just model across my room. And my bed was the ocean because it had a blue blanket. And this is something that's beyond language, that with my stories, when I would kind of write stories as a kid, I was trying to condense down into something that was cheap. My parents didn't have a lot of money. I was living at my ex-slave great-grandfather's house, though my dad's an economist now, so that's how that works. But
things change.
Yeah, but this is it. It's taken multiple generations for even my family itself to develop the language for me to tell what I'm telling now. And yeah, so you want to hear more about technology and language. I spent my entire life, like as a kid, just reading the dictionary because I was fascinated with the ways that words broke down because it doesn't fit my mouth. My father had a stutter and had to like learn how to talk throughout his life, and now he's like a public speaker. And I mean, it's kind of sad, and I hold on to Black and the Black Belt for a lot of this reason. Is I grew up Southern Baptist, and you have this sort of like this sort of Christian Protestant kind of belief down there of, I mean, it kind of became prosperity gospel over time, or I'll even quote like American philosopher John Hicks in his idea of the soul making theodicy, where God puts you through bad shit to make you stronger and to strengthen your soul. And anyway, there's a sense in the Black community, specifically in that South, and sometimes in like places like Chicago and Detroit, but mostly in that Black Belt region, there's people that are gurgling up and speaking and giving testimonies in their church in this like really spiritual way, saying, God has brought me through. And testimonies are one of the most beautiful things in the Black church. I remember one lady getting up there and being like, I beat cancer. I fought it and I beat it. And she like starts dancing, and the woman, her name is Shirley, the organist and pianist. She went improv piano, and there was a drummer and a guy on a Roland DX7, like just improvising while this woman was crying because she beat cancer. And my dad got up there once with the whole family and told how, he learned to speak, how he was able to beat a sort of typing exam in the Air Force and was able to work his way up into becoming an economist. And he spoke this through the stutter, and spoke this in front of 150 people in the church, and the whole church cried. And again, we danced and sang together. And you want to hear about technology, you want to hear about Blackness, and it's just like, come down to the South. And it's not to be like, specific about it, but I just like to tell people that like Black people in America, specifically in the Black Belt, are hostages. And what you saw with the Capitol riot a few weeks ago was literally Black people in the Southeast voting in a way that they were never supposed to vote, which was the compromise at the end of the Civil War. Black people, specifically in the South, were never supposed to count in an election in this way. And yeah, so it's people where I came from that pushed Biden right over that top, Stacey Abrams and like all those people down there. And America freaked the fuck out. They were just like, we're gonna go kill the president. I guess that was like their idea. And anyway, that's technology for you. That's using language, and technology is literally spending centuries learning how to speak a language because they didn't give us schools. They didn't give us stuff. Like I grew up with the textbooks being all ripped up and shit. Like I couldn't even dream of going to Ivy League school. So being here was like, I literally had to be reading dictionaries at like 5 years old. And like, I can't even find my aunt's book right now, but I was lucky enough to have aunts that got degrees in urban studies and learned to I was able to go through their books as a kid and understand how cities were built, specifically cities about Detroit. And anyway, I'll stop rambling about this, but it's, yeah, again, you want to hear more about technology. You're looking at the Black secret technology. I am my great grandfather's progeny. And as my dad likes to say, he wants to build an inheritance for his children's children. And I spend every day of my life gathering up from the first patriarch of my family, Isaiah Moore, and bringing it with me, and sharing it here. That's the usage of it.
Thanks so much. We've got another question. This viewer writes, Can you reflect on what effect the so-called Berlin or German techno phenomenon had on the development of mainstream US EDM? Could they differentiate and make the connection to its origins in Detroit?
No. I think, that a very concerted effort has to be made still in order to assert that. And I do think, it is part of a few previous waves, right? That I think particularly that EDM being associated with a kind of generic white Europeanness, but particularly when it really became something big around 10 years ago with the UK. That it's part, again, of this longer history of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, bringing Black music back to the United States, right? Even, that moment right before techno, where white British synth pop is really successful, right? The Depeche Modes, the Human Leagues, the Soft Cells, et cetera, and so on. Most of those groups were basically refashioned R&B groups. That's what they were trying to sound like. Soft Cell's biggest hit was actually, it was performed, it was a soul, Tainted Love. It was a soul song that was really popular in the UK, a cover version by Gloria Jones. And what was interesting, for instance, about that moment, right, is that synth pop initially was perceived as being too fey and gay in the United States. So it did not have any mainstream recognition until Black DJs in Detroit, in New York, and in Chicago started playing it on the radio, right? So it's this kind of irony that this is this kind of whitewashed Black music that then has to be translated for mainstream white U.S. audiences through Black radio in the in the United States, and that didn't really happen with EDM. I think there was a moment also where there was some crossover between EDM and R&B, Kelly Rowland's songs, for instance, or Nicki Minaj. I think, and I remember when that initially happened, people were like, "Why are they performing such white music?" Right? And I think it still has to be said in the United States over and over again that, techno is not only originally Black music, but it is Black music without any kind of qualification. So I think, that the kind of mainstreaming and whitewashing of Berlin techno and then later EDM that they have contributed to that the violent erasure in that in that history. And so I'll just stop there for now.
Yeah. I want to add to that there's another phenomenon here that happened along with the Kelly Rowling Nicki Minaj crossover that needs to be discussed. And that there's United Kingdom publications like Mixmag, DJ Mag, and Resident Advisor with the uptick of the EDM boom while the real estate crisis was booming down and student loans were skyrocketing. These UK publications thought that they could come over to America, set up shops in New York, and pretend like there was a dance music scene here where ultimately there was a few indie venues. If anyone has a memory, only 2 years before Resident Advisor and Mixmag started opening up offices, Animal Collective, Grizzly Bear, Vampire Weekend, that was the sound here. And you have these publications that started fabricating. They would grab a group like Lies Records, right, and go, here's some 5 dudes making cool beats, and they would try to uptick that and show it as being the New York sound, or grabbing the Bunker. Ultimately, an interview in 2008, Resident Advisor tried to state that they were not in the same world as EDM, but were trying to nip off the heels of EDM money and the EDM sort of Coachella fame. When I was working at Mixmag, they told me, when I was working at Mixmag in 2016 as the East Coast editor, I was told that they wanted the Mixmag to be the Fader. And I was like, you can't be the Fader with Richie Hawtin. That's not how that works here. You actually have to, I was like, how about Flying Lotus? But anyway, I like to state that the last 10 years, including this sort of celebration of Berlin that started with Der Kong Familie and the 20-year anniversary of the Love Parade, is all a PR psyop in the sense of marketing. It is all just it's a bunch of magazines
of
going
white nationalist marketing, right? That those people who feel like that they're sort of holding up the flag of true techno are very much feeding into, because it feeds their egos, And it's also easy to easy to do, right? And yeah, and again, to highlight that despite all of those things, the very idea of Berlin techno oftentimes includes this notion that this is something that opened things up and made it, made Germany less racist, more tolerant, et cetera, and so on, right? Even though it clearly was not, is not, and in the foreseeable future will not be.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've got quite a few questions myself, but we've got like 3 minutes left. So maybe I'll ask one more from our viewers on YouTube. So that's, do you feel the whitewashing of techno has discouraged Black producers to work or play in the techno tradition? Like that techno could have become something else?
I should answer this by saying, no one understands this, and this is partially because UK publications tried to come to America and tell people what was happening here. Trap music is the new techno. Like, the Black music literally, it starts with blues and it ends with trap. And you can go to a release in 2001 on Warp Records with James Stinson from Drexcia as Other People Place, and you have DJ Stingray as Mystic Tribe AI, and you hear the trap snare starting, but that's a completely different thing. But James Stinson died in Georgia. He died just like a few hours shy of Atlanta. But anyway, when I was growing up, my dad was listening to what was called progressive music. He would drive up to New York and Chicago, and he didn't know who the DJs were. He just had a friend who was DJing hip hop who would be with a bunch of dudes that were DJing techno in like the 80s. And that music faded away because he grew up. He got a job, he went to the military, became an economist. My mom became a social worker. She used to be like a freestyle rapper in New York and was like, priorities changed. And what basically happened was for 30 years, no one gave a shit. Like, Black people had crunk music. We had Memphis rap. We had we had Chopped and Screwed. We had mainstream.
Which are all electronic
yes,
techno music in one way or another, right?
Yeah, so the thing is, it just existed, and techno was a small fleck that like kind of went off to Europe, and everyone blew up and went crazy over, and they're just like, this is the end all be all of Black American music, and it's like,
No, and I mean, and there are also all these kinds of connections between genres such as techno and house and more popular mainstream Black music. So, for instance, the producer Manny Fresh, who made all the beats in at the turn of the century for I'm forgetting the record company, New Orleans.
Oh, whoa, I don't know.
Back That Ass Up.
Yeah, I know. That's a whole region unto itself. I don't even touch it.
He actually interned with Steve Still Curly.
Yeah.
And I remember when that sound first came out, it sounded like the techno and jungle records that I was listening to. And then years later reading that, there is that concrete connection. And hip hop has always been, and R&B to a certain extent also, just completely kind of omnivorous in terms of the sounds that it takes in.
Yeah, I mean, Marshall Jefferson and Larry Hurt were in a progressive rock band together. They weren't trying to make dance music; they were making progressive rock music. They were trying to sound like Rush or Herbie Hancock.
No, and that and that has always existed. And regardless of the Black musical genre that you look at, so often it is about getting those sounds out of the machines. It is about making people move, but also about using all the technologies and sounds that are available in that particular moment, right? And that techno doesn't nearly have like the same kind of, at least as its own genre, history in the U.S. And there are a lot more. I think, I'm thinking about someone such as Abdul Ali from Baltimore, who has this explicit sort of mission to not only make electronic music Black and queer again, but also to put themselves within the tradition of electronic music specifically in Baltimore, right? And then there are all these like subgenres. I'm also thinking about, all the different kind of Vogue House records, New Jersey Club, et cetera, and so on, that all these kind of micro scenes that are all very functional and oftentimes also built on like one or two samples. It's amazing that you have thousands of records that are based on these on the samples, like the Ha sample, or you know, the Lynn Collins Think Break in Baltimore Ha sample, more with Vogue House. So I think it's existed in all these different ways in these different genres, both mainstream and not, but not necessarily in the same kind of way. And I think, you know, when did the DEMF, when did that start? That was kind of the moment where I think in Detroit,
2001.
at least, yeah, in Detroit at least, there was a way of, you know, this has to be reclaimed, right? That was part of the mission of that.
The same year that Discogs, the same year that Discogs and Resident Advisors started. So there's a great refinancialization that was happening, quite similar to what we're trying to see right now.
Yeah. And that to me was one of the moments that I remember initially, where, you know, there was a refinancialization, but also this attempt to try to re-narrativize and bring it home. And I mean, of course, yeah, there's still folks in Detroit and beyond, Black folks who make techno, but also a lot of electronic musicians across the diaspora and even on the continent, right? Who are very, very explicit about wanting to make electronic music that is Black, right? Not only in terms of their identities, but that put themselves in those in those traditions. There's so many people. Lorraine James from the UK is one of my other favorites, to name someone who's not from the US. Also reggae music. I mean, the kind of electronic sounds that happened there in the history. But yeah, maybe we can get one more question.
I'm afraid I'm hearing from our production team that we've got to move on as we've got more program. I really hate to cut off this conversation.
This is great.
But I'm so glad that we were able to bring together this year. Hopefully one day in person, perhaps. You can join us in Berlin. It's a shame because there are a few other interesting questions coming in from the chat. But for those of you viewing, DeForrest will stick around for another 20 minutes or so to answer some more questions in the CTM Discord. If you're not in there already, you can find the information for that on our website. So thanks once again. A massive, massive thank you to Alexander and DeForrest for joining us today for this fantastic conversation.
I'm really honored. Thank you.
Thank you.